what the city is talking about.
The news that impacts you.
Welcome to the Montreal Now podcast.
I want to get to this story. We talked a couple of days ago about something I'd never heard. I'd not heard this term before. It is called a lost Canadian. And apparently there are thousands of people who find themselves in this situation right now. Melanie Barton is a New York Times best-selling author. You may know her if you read books as Julia Kent. She's one of those people caught in that situation right now, and she is on the line. Melanie, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
I know we started talking about this. We got cut off the other day. So I want you to just explain the situation you find yourself in. And as I said, it's not unique. I keep hearing, we had a gentleman on the other day saying literally there are thousands of people finding themselves in this situation. So what is a lost Canadian, and what have you been going through trying to get back to Canada?
All right. A lost Canadian is someone who has a parent, a grandparent, a great-grandparent who could not pass their citizenship on to a child or a grandchild, et cetera, born outside of Canada. And so I've been working toward claiming my Canadian citizenship for quite some time. It didn't just start with the new administration here in the United States. It started a long time ago, and so there are different kinds of lost Canadians, but many of us have been trying for years. I've known my whole life that both sides of my family were Canadian. My grandfather, Walter Barton, was from Rock Creek, BC. He emigrated here to the U.S., largely driven by poverty, found a job, married, had kids. And then my mother's side, they're all from Point Edward, Ontario, but ended up in Port Huron, Michigan. And so, in my grandfather's case, on my mother's side, some of the siblings were born in Point Edward, some were born in Port Huron. And so it's just a river and an international border dividing the family. But I've known my entire life, and I've been working. So in the early 2000s, I worked for a Canadian company. Then I began publishing fiction, and I started to come to Canada more and more, and started researching whether I could claim my citizenship. And my timing was off because I looked into it right after the 2009 law that established what's called the first generation limit. And when you talk about lost Canadians, you hear that term a lot, first generation limit. And so the ability to pass on Canadian citizenship ends with the first generation born outside of Canada, with very rare exceptions. I tried in 2015, I tried in 2020, I hired lawyers in Toronto to pay them for consultations and legal analysis, and the answer was always no. And then for lost Canadians, the December 2023 Bjorkquist decision that was handled by Justice Akbar Ali in the Ontario Supreme Court declared that the first generation limit was unconstitutional. And so lost Canadians now find ourselves in this limbo state because the Bjorkquist decision says first generation limit is unconstitutional. But Justice Akbar Ali gave Parliament the opportunity to do what it should do, which is legislate and pass a law defining all of this. And now 17 months later, we're still in limbo.
And I'm guessing part of that goes to the fact that Parliament is not sitting, right? We have a prorogued Parliament now, so nothing is going to happen.
Right. There's been a lot going on, certainly in Canadian politics, and then there's everything going on in the United States that affects Canadian politics. But yes, the limbo nonetheless stands for those of us who have these rights but can't exercise them, or do we? In other words, we're in limbo, literally.
Is your fear that if you were to try to come to Canada, you get turned back?
Well, I wouldn't call it so much fear as I have a business. So I have a small publishing company. And in order to move my small publishing company to Canada as a non-citizen, the current wait time is between 40 and 48 months. And I have minor children who need to be enrolled in school. I have adult children who have, we want to have connections to them. And the bottom line is that according to the Bjorkquist decision, we're Canadians.
You have a particular issue here as well. You said this happened before Donald Trump became president yet again, but this goes back to his first term. What was your rationale then? Were you worried, and are you still worried now based on your situation?
So I'm more worried now in the, and this is public from the Globe and Mail article that Marie Wolf wrote the other day. My oldest child is transgender, and so while I have been trying to reclaim citizenship since 2009, there's certainly more urgency to it now. And IRCC allows people like us, lost Canadians, to apply and use something called urgent processing. And that means that if anyone who applies falls into a category where they might be harmed, whether it's economically or personally. So, for instance, if you're experiencing any sort of transphobia, homophobia, racial discrimination, if you may risk losing a job or have business development loss, then you can apply. There's a very specific set of criteria that IRCC established under what's called interim measures. And so many people in the United States or other countries who are trying to reclaim their Canadian citizenship, who are in the LGBTQ plus community, are applying, and many people who are experiencing racial and religious discrimination as well are doing so. So there are ways to do this, but the urgency is definitely significantly greater now that the U.S. administration is making decisions to essentially take away rights from trans and gay people.
I asked Marc Miller, who was Canada's former immigration minister, when we first spoke, I said, I'll try to find out something for you. He's been gracious enough to come in and try to explain what's going on, because even though Parliament is pro-rogue, as you said, this has been something that's been going on for a while. So thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate it. You heard her story. Where are we on this, and what will change when there's a new government in place?
So this has a long history to it, and you heard from Don Chapman a couple of days ago on your show about the whole history behind the Citizenship Act and some of the discriminatory aspects of the Act. And indeed, there are so many variants of it where Canadians have become so-called lost. And this has been repaired in sort of a piecemeal fashion throughout our history. The latest decision that the author referred to, this decision that I was presented with when I became the immigration minister, was called Bjorkquist, by the name of the person who was one of the complainants, basically said that if you were born outside Canada, you could not pass your citizenship on to your progeny. Okay. So take the example of my kids that were born in the United States and in Sweden. If they were to have kids outside of Canada, they could not pass that on to them. And that was the law that Stephen Harper put into place in 2009 after the evacuation of Lebanon. And there was a whole debate about, in relation to the cost of evacuating people in Lebanon that were Canadian citizens, and the accusation that they were Canadians of convenience. Well, the court said that law was unconstitutional. So I was presented with a set of facts, didn't appeal it. But what the court didn't, because it didn't make sense, and I don't think we had a prospect of winning, but what the court said is that they would suspend the application of the judgment, Aaron, until we put forward legislation that made sense. Let's understand that not everyone can become Canadian, and you can't sit in the US or Brazil or in France and pass Canadian citizenship on with zero connection to Canada ad nauseum from generation to generation. But in the case of a first generation, so in this case, the case of my kids, they were entitled to pass citizenship onto their kids. But not forever. And so the court suspended the application while we put through a law that actually, as Don Chapman said the other day, for once in its history made the Citizenship Act constitutional. It's just that it's been stalled throughout Parliament as we've tried to introduce. We've had a very difficult parliamentary session, Aaron. You've covered this. We had all parties agreeing that this should go forward except for the Conservatives. They have their reasons for it, for not putting it forward. But it is something I think that enfranchises people's constitutional rights, and it's something that we wanted to get right while making sure that we made a careful decision about deciding who gets to become Canadian and who doesn't. And so one of the tests of being Canadian was to make sure that anyone who was entitled to be Canadian, the person that was passing it on, had some substantial connection to Canada.
To the country,
So 1,000 days in Canada, so that they could then pass it on to their kid, and it wasn't sort of something that got passed on till the end of time.
So in the case of Melanie, who's on the phone, I mean, she seems to have a reasonable claim here to suggest that she should be allowed to come back into the country. Right?
Yeah, it sounds reasonable. I'd have to look at the facts of. She seems to have Melanie seems to have sides of both families that have Canadian connection. Obviously, a heart attached to Canada, but it's something that would have to be made not by me. The one missing element in this is that just before we were prorogued, or before the Parliament was dissolved, rather, I did instruct my department to put in a set of parameters so that while people were waiting, not only exigent circumstances could be looked at, but an attempt to try to mimic what the court would want, which is to make sure that people with that first generation cutoff were treated fairly and in a more equitable fashion. So that's currently what they're trying to put into place. The court is and will be looking at that as it suspends the application, as it continues or not to suspend the application of the decision, but it's something that's ongoing. The real cure to this, Aaron, is that we have to get back to Parliament and pass a law that makes sense.
All right. Well, there you go. Melanie, I don't know if that provides some hope or not, but at least, the governments are aware of it. I think all governments, all parties are aware of this. And as the minister said, that's the kind of thing that hopefully will get looked at once Parliament does resume. And that's only a matter of time. That's by the end of this month. I wish you the best, Melanie. I thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aaron. And thank you, Minister Miller.
Bringing you the breaking news and the people making it. Montreal Now with Aaron Rand, CJAD 800.
All right, it is time for us to check in as we do every Tuesday afternoon with Dr. Joe Schwarz. By the way, you can hear Dr. Joe every Sunday at 3 o'clock here on CJAD 800, and he is full-time job, director of the McGill Office for Science and Society. Joe, I sent you a story this morning on organic foods. The basic story, I think, if we can summarize it, was, you know what? If you're eating organic foods because you think they will, are healthier for you or will stave off disease, you might want to think twice. And you wrote me back saying, hey, this is more of the same. We already know this, right?
Yeah. We've discussed this before. I think just about every year when the Environmental Working Group in Washington comes out with their Dirty Dozen list as spring rolls around and people are starting to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables. And then they vilify a number of these by saying that they are laden with pesticides. Now, to get the thing straight, I mean, let's face it, pesticides are toxic, right? I mean, that's why they are made, in order to kill either weeds or insects. So nobody questions the fact that pesticides are potentially dangerous. However, no company is allowed to just on a whim decide that we're going to use this pesticide in this fashion. It has to go through various regulatory hurdles in the U.S. With FDA, although who runs the FDA now, nobody knows, and what they're going to be doing or not doing, nobody knows. But in Canada, it's Health Canada. And Health Canada oversees the Office for Pesticide Management. So there's a lot of data that has to be submitted. And then the government decides that you can use this pesticide at such a dose on such a crop, how many times, etc., and what the residues are allowed. And the residues are determined through toxicity studies on animals. You determine what is called the NOAEL level, the No Observed Adverse Effect level, whereby you give animals, either mice or rats, increasing doses of the substance until some effect is seen, and then you build in a safety factor of 100 when it comes to human exposure. So there's a lot of regulatory stuff that goes on before something is released onto the market. Now, the Environmental Working Group comes out with their Dirty Dozen based on the number of pesticide residues that are found. So, for example, last year, I think it was strawberries, because they found out there were more pesticide residues on strawberries than on other fruits. Mm-hmm. But it is not the number of pesticides that matters. It is the amount. And they don't pay any attention to that. Yes, there may have been more different pesticides on strawberries, but they were all way, way below the level that is allowed as maximum. So it doesn't matter how many different. The question is, what is their sum total?
Right.
And it was much less than anything to worry about. So I think what we have to say there is the most important thing is to get your 5 to 7 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. Whether it's organic or not should be a secondary consideration. Prime consideration should be to get them. And unfortunately, it's not happening in North America. You know what the average is, given the fact that we are recommending, at least 5 to 7. You know what it is?
What are we talking about here in terms of number of servings?
The number of servings of fruits and vegetables combined a day.
A day.
On average North American. 1? Yeah, 1.8 actually. Mm. But that's taking French fries, believe it or not, as
as a vegetable.
As a vegetable.
Okay.
Exactly. So this is where the emphasis has to be on how do we get people to eat more fruits and vegetables. And if money is not a concern, yes, organic has fewer pesticide residues. Whether that's meaningful or not, nobody really knows. But if you want to sort of soothe your soul, but I think it would be better to use the same amount of money to buy more fruits and vegetables.
By the way, it's just a matter, or is it just a matter of you're coming home, if you're concerned with pesticides on fruit and vegetables, you wash your fruits and vegetables. Is there a question as to how much that actually reduces or whether it actually seeps into the fruit? How does that work?
Actually, the real reason that you need to wash your fruits and vegetables is because of bacterial contamination. That's the much, much better reason. Pesticides, if they are on the surface, they will be washed off, but pesticides also can soak into the fruit or vegetable. So, but the washing is important because bacterial contamination is a far, far, far bigger issue than pesticide residues.
By the way, with respect to this list that you talk about, the Dirty Dozen, which is the 12 fruits or vegetables that have the most pesticides, is there some question as to who comes up with this list?
This is the Environmental Working Group in Washington, which is an organization that is very silent about the fact that they get funding from the organic industry.
Oh.
So
I see.
Yeah. And they're the ones who see a boogeyman behind every bush, And the fact is in life that there are boogeymen behind bushes, but they are not behind every bush. And you have to know how to evaluate risk and what is important and what is not important and when you should be scaring people and when not.
All right. I like what you said. If you have the money, you want to buy organic, that's all well and good. If not, just buy more and eat more fruits and vegetables.
That's it.
Wash them off and we're good to go. Joe, we'll leave it at that. I thank you. We'll talk to you next week.
The very latest news, reported and discussed. Welcome back to Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
All right. As I said, when I first saw the story a couple of days ago, I kind of shook my head and went, wait a sec. No, we don't deal with tuberculosis anymore. This is, 50 years or 70 years ago, maybe. But then I see there are 2 cases of tuberculosis that have been confirmed in Montreal in the East End, Mercier-Hochelaga district. And I thought we better find out more because, let's face it, there has been a lot of anti-vax reaction. And some of those people who choose not to get, vaccines or to take antibiotics for tuberculosis for whatever reason, maybe you're making a big mistake. But I thought rather than me speculate, let's talk to Dr. Chris Labos. He's a cardiologist with a degree in epidemiology. He's a regular, of course, here on CJD. Chris, tuberculosis, as I said, I thought we were done with this a long time ago. What's going on here?
Well, the unfortunate reality is that we're not done with tuberculosis. And while we don't see very much of it, in Montreal, in most of the urban centers in North America, globally, it's still a major problem. And in the north of Quebec, especially amongst the native populations, it has always remained a big problem. So it's unfortunately one of the situations where out of sight means out of mind. And so we stopped thinking about it. And yet globally, and in terms of public health, it remains a significant issue, mainly because we can't get the treatment and the resources to the people who need it.
Okay, so am I then sort of off track here, suggesting that part of maybe why we're seeing a comeback, if you can call it that at least, is because of vaccine hesitancy or antibiotic hesitancy?
Well, I think there's a few issues that are in it. I mean, there is a vaccine against tuberculosis. We tend not to use it that much anymore. It wasn't all that effective. It had some value. And people who were born in sort of Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, may have gotten the vaccine as a child. We don't tend to give it in North America because the reason why we don't see tuberculosis anymore here is because we can treat it with antibiotics. The problem is that it's not a 2-week course of antibiotics like if you had a urinary tract infection. if you had a pneumonia, urinary tract infection would just be a few days of antibiotics. It is months-long antibiotic therapy, and sort of making sure that you have the resources and the follow-up in place to make sure that people are getting their antibiotics and taking them regularly is why it's so hard to get rid of tuberculosis in some of the more remote parts of Canada and globally. How much is, anti-science, anti-vaccine, anti-medicine treatment, how much is that philosophy playing into it? I think to a certain extent, sort of distrust in science, sort of the anti-establishment messages that are going on there will potentially make somebody less willing to comply with treatment. And this idea of doctors don't know best, I know best, I'm going to do what's right for me, I think it's certainly contributing to the issue. I think the reason why we haven't seen a huge explosion right now is because, at least here in Montreal, at least in the urban centers, when somebody's diagnosed, they are usually treated. Why this is making the news now is because when you have these cases pop up like this, public health really does have to ramp up into gear to do contact tracing to make sure that everybody that was potentially exposed to these index cases gets tested, gets treated. That's how you prevent the spread of tuberculosis. That's why we don't have people being sent off to sanitariums the way we would have 50, 60, 70 years ago.
So if I read this right, though, my understanding is, first of all, it's contagious, which is, scary enough. And second of all, the cases that we're talking about here, these two particular cases in the city, it took how long for symptoms to actually tell us this was tuberculosis? Did I read this right? 6 months?
Yeah, so you're right. Tuberculosis is very, very infectious. It's funny in that in the pre-COVID era, when we talked about airborne spread of diseases, we only talk about them for two diseases, measles and tuberculosis. For everything else, we were still talking about droplets, and that's where the whole, 6 feet and thing came from. And I think we have a much better understanding and a much better realization that many things are airborne spread. But tuberculosis is very, very infectious, much like measles. And that's why we used to talk about airborne spread. So one person who is sick can actually infect a lot of people. The reason why it takes so long to make a diagnosis is because, well, first of all, people aren't thinking tuberculosis the way they would have 50, 60 years ago because it is so relatively rare in Montreal, but it's actually harder to make a diagnosis. Yet the bacteria are hard to grow in a lab. You have to get a good sputum sample, and somebody who's coughing and, may not go see a doctor, it can take a while for a diagnosis to be made or for symptoms to get bad enough for somebody to seek medical attention, especially if they don't have a family doctor. So it is, in one sense, shocking and disappointing, but maybe it shouldn't be surprising us as much as it does because this is what happens when the healthcare system starts to unravel. It's not the hospital on fire and panic in the streets. It's stuff that should be straightforward, taking longer and longer to happen in cases like this falling through the cracks. So
if I can, are you worried of a spread here? I know it's just 2 cases, but as we said, it is contagious. Are there things to be conscious of? And what are symptoms here, by the way?
Well, tuberculosis can be a very complex disease, and some people can harbor tuberculosis in their bodies for years. That's what we used to call latent tuberculosis. The bacteria is in there, and it won't cause any symptoms, but it can reactivate at some future point in time. The classical symptoms are essentially a very bad pneumonia. You're coughing, sometimes coughing up blood. It's a very bad lung infection that can really damage your lungs. So, I don't think it's going to be a big risk here in the case that I don't think we're going to start seeing hundreds and thousands of cases of tuberculosis in Montreal because we know how to deal with it. Public health is ramping up into gear. You contact trace everybody. You test them for tuberculosis. You give them the course of antibiotics. We know how to eradicate tuberculosis. We've done it, right? We don't have tuberculosis cases much in Montreal anymore. I think the real worry is not so much here, but if you start cutting resources to public health, much as they're doing in the U.S., do you start losing the capacity to do stuff like this, and do things slowly start to unravel, and do you start having not a drastic deterioration, but a slow and steady deterioration in public health where diseases that were once forgotten are now starting to make a comeback, and we're starting to see the early hints of maybe us getting into that situation. So it's more of a long-term concern that if we don't keep up the fight, as it were, things could continue to worsen.
I want to just go back to that for a second. You talk about diseases that we don't talk about anywhere. What are we looking here? I mean, is typhus coming back? Is scurvy on the way? Or is it the Black Plague we have to worry about? What's going on? Why are these coming back?
Well, you joke about scurvy. In fact, I think it was last fall in Ontario, there were a couple of cases of scurvy, and that was because the affordability crisis, people not being able to access, fresh food and vegetables, and actually getting vitamin C deficiency. As shocking as that sounds, that actually did happen here in Canada. But this is the problem, right? A lot of these things are manageable. Now, a lot of them are manageable with adequate resources, making sure people have enough to eat, clean drinking water, and at least in the urban centers of Canada, that's still okay. Part of the problems why we start seeing stuff like this, especially in native reserves, is we have a chronic issue there with no clean drinking water. Many native reserves are still under boiled water advisory, sometimes for years. Right. I mean, that is kind of shameful in Canada that we're still doing that. So the more you let things slip, the more you say, like, this is not that bad, I'm okay, that's when you start having situations like this. And it's not a drastic decline. We're sort of like the frog in the pot that's slowly getting boiled. Things get a little bit worse every year. And unless somebody sort of issues a wake-up call and course corrects, they just continue to get a little bit worse every year, drop by drop by drop by drop. And simple things don't get fixed.
Well, thanks for the encouraging news, Chris. That's wonderful. Listen, I always appreciate you weighing in on this, so thank you so much.
My pleasure. You take care.
Dr. Chris Lai. By the way, you can hear him on the weekends. He's here every Sunday with Joanne Vrakis at 7:20 a.m. Imagine that. Leprosy coming. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but to his point, you know what? Maybe it's not.
Because you don't want to miss a thing. Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
Let me go to Chris Dimakos, our CJD 800 legal contributor. So, Chris, interesting situation today. So let's talk about this. They said a recent judgment basically providing a warning to employers who hire employees with something called a two-step process. So I'm going to ask you to describe what a two-step process is and what this really entailed.
Right. It's pretty common. If you are an employee, you're looking for a job, there are multiple occasions where you speak with the company. They send you an email telling you what your salary is, giving you a brief description of what the job is. You confirm, and then once you start working there, they put before you a much more formal contract with additional language, additional responsibilities, something that is, a 5 or 6 pager that you didn't have when you agreed to it. And the reason why companies do that is they don't like to divulge sometimes all the inner workings of how their company works in terms of sales or whatever the position is. So they try to keep as much as they can private. So they try to reel you in by having that first email with the basic salary and the basic, conditions confirmed, and then they try to slip in this second, more thorough contract at a later date. So what happened with this judgment was a woman was hired on an email. She agreed to the salary, agreed to the job title. She starts working. Within the first couple of days, she's presented with a much more formal contract with a lot more language and conditions. She signs that. A few years later, she ends up getting terminated because she violated some of the language that was in that second document that wasn't present on the first one. And what the court said was, no, you can't do that. That's an illegal termination because you didn't present that to her when she agreed to take the job. And when you gave her this additional language and the additional conditions, well, you never gave her consideration for that. You never paid her more for it. You never gave her some sort of incentive to sign off on that. All you did was make her give concessions. So what the lesson is here is be careful when you are looking to join a new company. Make sure that whenever you're signing off on it, that's the final document. You don't, ask questions. You don't want to just basically sign off on an email or a verbal agreement and then be faced with having a completely much more formal document that requires much more out of you than you originally thought. It's very important. Companies more and more now are going to have to start including everything at the get-go and not try to do this two-step process where they get you on board and then present you with the much more formal contract.
Yeah, you're discussing something or outlining something that seems to me like a classic bait and switch, almost in a sense, right?
It is, and it's not so. I think what the companies, the reason why they do it is they want to hire the right candidates, and they don't want to run the risk of sending you a formal contract that details how commissions are paid, that details what their policy is and what their severance is, and all these benefits without getting the employee to confirm that they're gonna come on board, right? So it's kind of like they want their cake and eating it too. They want to be able to protect as much sensitive information as they can. The problem with that is is that you're doing so at the expense of the employee. You're taking the risk of having somebody come on board that might have not come on board had they had the full picture. So more and more we're seeing case law that's saying, hey, when you hire somebody, you got to give them the full scope of what they're signing on for. And if you're going to try to add some stuff to their plate afterwards, make sure that you compensate them for it, because if you don't, you run the risk of it becoming ineffective, right? So in this case, they used that language to terminate. It was deemed ineffective and it didn't govern that relationship, so it was thrown out. And this individual got paid a lot more money because that clause was deemed inoperable. It wasn't effective.
By the way, this goes to something we often talk about, which is this whole idea of, before you sign anything, get some legal advice. But in this case, your first offer, even if it's written, right, you can take it and have it legally looked at, and it looks fine. It's when you sign that second offer, maybe before you do that, that's the one you should be taking to have checked.
Right, and I think the best advice I can give is, if you are when you are going through the interview process, ask a lot of questions about what the process is like after you say, okay, I'm in, I'm signing off on this. What happens next? Is there any other documents I got to sign? Is there any other group plans that I'm going to be a part of? Any type of deductions to my salary that I'm going to have? You want to know as much as you can about the job after you sign off. And sometimes companies will say, well, yeah, there's going to be a more formal document you're going to have to sign. Well, ask for that up front. Say, can I have that, please? I'd like to see that before I sign off on this employment position. So ask the questions, ask as many questions as you can beforehand, so you know exactly what you're signing on for. Because sometimes, the worst thing is if you're employed with a company and you're considering leaving one job for the next, and then you do so only to find out that, this is not as good as I thought it was, because they presented you with all this additional stuff afterwards. So you want to have as much information as you can in terms of what the job is going to be like and what your obligations are going to be beforehand, before you sign off on that, because you don't want to leave a job that you're okay with to go somewhere with the unknown of taking that risk and maybe conceding what you had at your previous job. Yeah,
to your point, right? A ruling here. So someone took this to court and a judge agreed. So obviously there's a precedent set here now.
Absolutely. So in this case, it worked out for the employee, even though she signed it. She didn't get legal advice at the time. She signed it. It actually worked out for her in the end, because it's the employer that actually made the mistake. But you don't want to take that chance. You don't want to say to yourself, well, I'm probably going to have this thrown out anyway, so I'll go ahead and sign this without getting it looked at. You definitely want to make sure you get as much advice as possible. And again, transparency, be transparent. Ask them as many questions as you can so you understand what you're getting yourself into.
Chris Dimakos, our CJAD 800 legal contributor. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Aaron.
Bringing you the breaking news and the people making it. Montreal Now with Aaron Rand. CJAD 800.
The real discussion today so far has been reaction to what happened yesterday with the Donald Trump tariff announcement. And to some degree, and we talked about this yesterday afternoon, and I think a lot of people probably agree, Canada got off, if we can say lucky, dodged a bullet. It doesn't matter the term you use, but basically we did not have any new tariffs put on Canada. We're still dealing with the existing ones, which include aluminum and steel and all the others, and the auto tariffs, although there's some question as to what specifically they apply to. But then today, Mark Carney, acting as Prime Minister, announced that we are going to do the same thing to the U.S. that the U.S. has done to us, at least with respect to auto tariffs, imposing a 25% tariffs on cars coming into Canada from the U.S. My question when we first talked about this was, what does this mean at the end of the day, not just for the industry, but anybody out there considering buying a car? So let's dig in. Greg Layson's a digital editor at Automotive News Canada and is on the line. Greg, thanks for making the time. Appreciate it.
No problem. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
So let me start with that question first of all, because here's what I didn't understand in Mark Carney's announcement today. He said it applies to cars brought into Canada, but it does not apply to auto parts, at least not as they relate to satisfying the CUSMA agreement. What does that mean exactly?
So what Mark Carney announced today is this, that auto parts on their own as standalone products or pieces that will be used in assembly in Canada will not face a tariff. So let's just use widgets for a simple word. If a widget is made in Michigan but needed in auto assembly in Ontario, it will not face a tariff when it crosses the border. However, if a finished product, let's say a Jeep from Toledo, crosses the border, crosses the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor to be delivered somewhere in Quebec, then whatever content in that Jeep was produced in America and America only faces a 25% tariff. Now, that's probably about 40%, 50%, 60%, depending on the market and the region of that vehicle. That's how this is going to work.
Okay, I'm confused. I get the part about auto parts. If you buy them independently and they're not already in the cars, I get that they're not tariffed. But
correct.
Take your example of the Jeep that is coming in from, we understand part of that Jeep, an engine is manufactured in Canada, something else is manufactured in the U.S., I don't know, maybe something else in Mexico. How would it work? Who's going to break that down?
That is the job of our fantastic workers at the border, our customs agents. And the onus is on the importer. So, Stellantis Canada, if we're going to use a Jeep as an example, they are responsible for telling Canada how much of the value of that Jeep is American made and therefore subject to a tariff. Vice versa, a minivan made in Windsor, sent to the United States, it is up to Stellantis on the United States side of the border to tell U.S. Customs and Border Patrol how much of that vehicle, what percentage is Canada made, and therefore that percentage faces the tariff. It is incredibly confusing. It is a lot of paperwork and red tape for automakers on both sides of the border, and that is time and money beyond just the tariff that is costing the automakers, and it will be passed on to the consumer. So not only are we going to face the rising costs based on just the tariffs alone, but the additional workload of the automakers, those accountants and lawyers that have to sort this out sooner rather than later.
Okay, that's a great explanation. I will ask you, though, bear with me here. Let's stay with the Jeep for just a second. So let's say that Jeep costs, I don't know, what would it cost here in Canada? $30,000, $35,000? I have no idea. What would it cost?
You use a round number of $50,000. That's the average transaction price right now in Canada for all vehicles.
Okay, so of that $50,000, let's say there's less than 50% of U.S. parts in that car. Does it still get tariffed, or is it only if it's over 50%?
No, the portion that is American-made gets tariffed. So if we use $50,000 as a round number, let's say $25,000 of that is American-made product, tariffs, brakes, widgets, door handles, whatever. That $25,000 in value faces the 25% tariff. So essentially, it's a 12.5% tariff total on that vehicle because not all of it is going to be tariffed coming across the border.
Got it. Okay. Well explained. So bottom line, as I said when we started here, however this plays into effect, because it's going to go into effect on both sides of the border, everyone, whether you're here or whether in the U.S., you're going to pay more for a new car.
Absolutely. I think that's why it's important we have these conversations. I mean, I cover this for a living, 12 hours a day, every day, and I understand what's going on here, and I know the prices are going to go up. I don't think Canadians realize how much of a price increase this is going to bring to just about all vehicles. 40% of the vehicles we buy in Canada come from the United States. All of those vehicles, essentially, aside from a few niche vehicles, will face some sort of tariff at the border. On the flip side of that, I always use Ford as an example. We build Ford engines in Windsor, Ontario. None of them are put in a vehicle that is made in Ontario. They are all put in vehicles that are made, final assembly, in the United States. But those Ford Super Duties are shipped back here and we buy them. We will, in effect, pay the duty on that engine that went to the United States because the automakers are going to pass all those costs on to Canadians. So whether we retaliated or not, there was going to be a price increase. Now there's a price increase on just about every vehicle sold in Canada moving forward.
Had we not retaliated, as Marc Carney announced today, right, and just left the tariffs in place on Canada right now, that the U.S. announced, yes, well, they announced it a while ago, but in effect, basically, I guess today or at the end of the week, that would have been a lower price increase, or would it not change the price for Canadians at all if we had not retaliated?
It would have been lower. It would have been lower because we had no tariffs on vehicles coming in. We would just be paying the U.S. tariffs on parts and vehicles that went to the States and then were shipped back to us. Now it's everything. And so by adding this, he is increasing the cost of essentially every vehicle sold in Canada, other than anything that's made in Japan and shipped here, or Korea and shipped here, or Vietnam and shipped here, or from the UK or EU.
Right. So those tariffs, which, by the way, the U.S. is imposing as well, right? If you're buying a car from Europe or Japan or Korea, as we learned yesterday, there'd be tariffs on all those cars. They will become much more expensive in the U.S.
That's correct. So let's use BMW as an example. If BMW ships the same vehicles direct to Canada, no tariff. If they ship that to the United States, tariff, and the Americans will pay that. So where you won't see a price increase is really on the luxury side of things. Right. The vehicles that come from the EU, mainly from Germany. You won't see any on anything that comes from Korea. So think Kia and Hyundai, for example. But everything that comes from America, and that's about 40%, almost 50% in some cases on some years, of vehicles that we buy come from the United States. And then, of course, whatever parts that ship back and forth across the border, that too will increase your sticker price.
Now, the only other question I have is we all know Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. are part of the CUSMA agreement, right? And we know that as long as they're part of that, they don't get tariffed. Where does that come into play here?
So what the United States and Canada have done is the United States made its first move and said, look, there really should be no tariffs at all on any North American vehicles, but if we're going to put a tariff on, we're only going to tax the Canadian content. So it's not taxing the U.S. content that's in a Canada-made vehicle. It's only taxing the Canadian content. But legally speaking, the suppliers and the automakers believe that there should be no tariffs because we have a North American free trade agreement in that Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement. So I would not be surprised if at some point over the next 2 weeks, there are automakers and suppliers or a conglomerate of those taking the U.S. to court to fight this, saying, look, you have no right to impose these tariffs because we have a free trade agreement. This thing is going to get more confusing and more gummed up as we move along. Sooner than it's going to be sorted out. That's my fear in all of this. A lot of red tape, a lot of paperwork, and a lot of price increases in the short term.
As you understand it, Greg, just as we wrap up, when does this come into effect?
So right now, the tariffs on Canadian goods going over are in effect as of midnight last night. I believe Marc Carney's announcement goes into effect tomorrow. Now, the parts that go from Canada to the United States, they will not be tariffed until May 3rd because I hearken back to what I started with. They don't know how they're going to determine how much of each of those parts is Canadian versus American. They don't have the forms and the paperwork at the border yet worked out, but they say they will have that done by May 3rd. So your key dates were April 3rd, April 4th, and May 3rd. But right now, if you're looking for a new vehicle, go buy this month because the interest rates are out, the incentives are out, and whatever prices are on those windows and whatever rates are in place now should not change until May 1st. So if you're shopping, do it now.
Greg Layton, thank you so much, Greg. Really appreciate the time.
Yeah, anytime.
All right. Automotive News Canada is where he works. I think pretty well explained there, right? That's what's happening. That's when it goes into effect. And ultimately, yes, as he said, prices will be going up on both sides of the border. Yeah, it's confusing.
This has been the Montreal Now podcast.
Listen live on your radio weekday afternoons from 2 to 6
on CJAD 800
or through the iHeartRadio app.